The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds of Forward Operating Base Sentinel, where Specialist Maria Santos was running her final lap around the perimeter. Her combat boots hit the dusty ground in a steady rhythm as she pushed herself through the last quarter mile. At 24, Maria had earned her place in the elite reconnaissance unit through sheer determination and skill that outmatched most of her male counterparts. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison watched her from the equipment shed, his face twisted with the same resentment he had carried for the past 6 months since Maria joined their unit. In his mind, women had no place in special operations, and he made sure everyone knew it. The fact that Maria consistently outperformed half his team only made his anger burn hotter. "There goes the diversity hire again," Morrison muttered to Corporal Bennett, who was cleaning his rifle nearby. "Command thinks putting a girl in our unit makes them look progressive. Wait until she cracks under real pressure." Bennett kept his eyes on his weapon, uncomfortable with Morrison's constant complaints, but unwilling to challenge a superior. The whole unit knew about Morrison's attitude toward Maria, but most chose to stay out of it. Maria finished her run and walked toward the barracks, her breathing controlled despite the intense workout. She had learned to ignore Morrison's comments and focused instead on proving herself through her actions. Her marksmanship scores were the highest in the unit, and her tactical intelligence had saved lives during their last deployment. As she passed the equipment shed, Morrison stepped directly into her path. "Santos, you missed a spot on your bunk inspection this morning. Drop and give me 50. Maria stopped and looked at him calmly. She knew her bunk had been perfect, as it always was. This was just another one of Morrison's attempts to humiliate her in front of the other soldiers. "My bunk passed inspection, Staff Sergeant." Sergeant Williams signed off on it. Morrison's face reddened. The fact that she didn't immediately comply with his order, even though it was based on a lie, infuriated him. Several other soldiers had gathered around, sensing trouble brewing. "Are you questioning my authority, Specialist?" Morrison stepped closer, using his height advantage to intimidate her. "I don't care what Williams said. I'm telling you your bunk was unsatisfactory. With respect, Staff Sergeant, I followed proper protocol. If you have an issue with my quarters, I suggest you speak with Sergeant Williams." Maria's voice remained steady, but those who knew her could see the steel in her eyes. The confrontation was drawing more attention. Privates Johnson and Rodriguez had stopped their equipment maintenance to watch, while Corporal Martinez pretended to organize supplies nearby. Everyone knew Morrison had been looking for an excuse to go after Maria, and it seemed like he was finally going to get his chance. Morrison's hands clenched into fists. He had been waiting months for Maria to show what he considered disrespect, and now he had his justification. "You think because you can shoot straight and run fast that you're special? You're nothing but a liability waiting to happen." "I've never been a liability to this unit," Maria replied firmly. "My record speaks for itself." "Your record?" Morrison laughed bitterly. "You mean the record where command gives you easier assignments, and the rest of us have to pick up your slack? You think you belong here, but you're just playing soldier." The insult hit its mark, but Maria refused to let her anger show. She had worked twice as hard as everyone else to earn her place, and she wasn't going to let Morrison's prejudice break her composure. "I've completed every mission assigned to me successfully," she said. "I've never asked for special treatment, and I've never let this unit down." Morrison stepped even closer, violating her personal space. "You let this unit down just by being here. Real soldiers don't need to prove themselves because they belong. You're just a political statement in a uniform." The circle of watching soldiers grew larger. Some looked uncomfortable with Morrison's behavior, but none were willing to intervene. Challenging a staff sergeant, especially one as volatile as Morrison, could end their careers. "I earned my place here through the same training and qualifications as everyone else," Maria said, her voice still controlled, but with an edge that warned she was reaching her limit. "Earn?" Morrison's voice rose to nearly a shout. "You earn nothing. Command handed you this position because they needed to fill a quota. You're taking up space that should go to a real soldier who can actually do the job. Maria felt her carefully maintained composure starting to crack. She had endured months of Morrison's harassment, always taking the professional route, always following proper channels. But standing here in front of half the unit while he questioned her qualifications and dedication was pushing her past her breaking point. "I've proven myself in combat," she said, her voice now carrying a warning. "I've saved lives in this unit, including yours during the Kandahar operation when my intelligence prevented us from walking into that ambush." Morrison's face went purple with rage at the reminder of how Maria's quick thinking had indeed saved their entire squad 6 months earlier. The fact that she was right only made him angrier. "That was luck, not skill," he snarled. "Any real soldier would have caught that same intel. You just happened to be in the right place at the right time." The watching soldiers exchanged glances. They all remembered the Kandahar mission, and they knew Morrison was lying. Maria's tactical analysis and reconnaissance work had been exceptional, and her warning had prevented what could have been a massacre. "It wasn't luck," Maria said firmly. "It was training, preparation, and doing my job. The same job I do every day in this unit." Morrison had reached his breaking point. All his resentment, his prejudice, and his wounded pride boiled over into pure rage. In his twisted thinking, Maria's calm professionalism was just another sign of disrespect, another challenge to his authority that needed to be crushed. "You want to keep running your mouth?" he yelled. "Maybe it's time someone taught you some respect." Before anyone could react, Morrison drew his leg back and delivered a vicious kick directly to Maria's stomach. The impact was brutal and unexpected, lifting her off her feet and sending her crashing to the ground. She hit the dusty earth hard, gasping for breath as pain exploded through her midsection. The watching soldiers stood in shocked silence. They had seen Morrison be harsh and unfair, but physical violence against a subordinate crossed every line in the military code. Several soldiers instinctively stepped forward, but Morrison's rank and reputation for retaliation kept them frozen in place. Maria struggled to breathe, curled on the ground with her arms wrapped around her ribs. The kick had been delivered with Morrison's full strength, and she could feel the deep ache that suggested possible internal injuries. But even through the pain, her mind was working, cataloging everything that had happened, every witness, every word that had been spoken. Morrison stood over her, his chest heaving with adrenaline and rage. "Maybe now you'll learn to show some respect to your superiors. Get up and get out of my sight before I decide to teach you another lesson." The silence that followed was deafening. 20 soldiers stood watching their fellow service member writhe in pain on the ground, knowing they had just witnessed a criminal assault, but unsure how to respond. Morrison's position of authority and his history of making life difficult for anyone who crossed him had created a culture of fear that paralyzed even good soldiers. Private Johnson started to move toward Maria, but Morrison's glare stopped him cold. "Anyone who helps her is going to answer to me personally." Santos wanted to be treated like a soldier, so she can get up like a soldier. Maria slowly pushed herself up to her knees, then stood with obvious effort. Her face was pale, and she kept one arm pressed against her ribs, but her eyes were clear and focused. She looked directly at Morrison, memorizing every detail of his face, every word he had spoken, every soldier who had witnessed what just happened. "This isn't over," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying absolute certainty. Morrison laughed harshly. "You're right about that. Step out of line again, and next time will be worse. Now get moving before I decide you need another lesson in military discipline." Maria turned and walked slowly toward the medical facility, each step sending waves of pain through her torso. She passed the circle of watching soldiers, making eye contact with each one, silently asking them to remember what they had seen. As she disappeared around the corner of the nearest building, the soldiers began to disperse in uncomfortable silence. They had all witnessed something that violated everything the military stood for, but Morrison's threats and their own concerns about career consequences kept them quiet. Morrison felt a surge of satisfaction as he watched the soldiers scatter. In his mind, he had finally put Maria in her place and shown the rest of the unit what happened to anyone who challenged his authority. He had no way of knowing that in 18 hours, 3 vehicles would arrive at the base, carrying officers whose authority made his own seem insignificant. The medical facility was a small building near the center of the base, staffed by a Navy corpsman and a nurse practitioner. When Maria walked through the door, Petty Officer Rodriguez immediately noticed her condition. "What happened to you, Santos?" Rodriguez asked, helping her to an examination table. "Training accident," Maria replied carefully. She wasn't ready to make her report yet, not until she had thought through all the implications and consequences. Rodriguez wasn't buying the explanation, but he focused on treating her injuries. X-rays revealed bruised ribs, but no fractures, and a thorough examination showed no signs of internal bleeding. Still, the pattern of the bruising was consistent with a direct blow, not an accident. "You should file a report," Rodriguez said quietly as he wrapped her ribs. "Whatever really happened here, you need to document it." Maria nodded, but remained silent. She knew Rodriguez was right, but she also knew that filing a complaint against Morrison would require her to navigate a complex military justice system that hadn't always been friendly to soldiers like her. She needed to think carefully about her next move. After receiving treatment, Maria returned to her bunk and sat on her perfectly made bed, staring at the wall while she processed what had happened. The physical pain was manageable, but the larger implications were overwhelming. Morrison had crossed a line that could end his career, but taking him down would require her to fight a battle she wasn't sure she could win. As the afternoon wore on, word of the incident spread quietly through the base. Soldiers who hadn't witnessed the assault heard whispered accounts from those who had. The details varied, but the basic facts remained consistent. Staff Sergeant Morrison had physically assaulted Specialist Santos in front of multiple witnesses. In his quarters, Morrison was already working on his version of events. If anyone asked, Santos had been insubordinate and he'd been forced to use necessary physical force to maintain discipline. He was confident that his rank and reputation would protect him from any serious consequences. What neither Morrison nor Maria knew was that their confrontation had been observed by someone else entirely. Master Sergeant Thompson, the base's senior non-commissioned officer, had been conducting a routine inspection of the training facilities when he heard shouting from the equipment area. Thompson had arrived just in time to see Morrison deliver the kick and watch Maria fall to the ground. As a 30-year veteran with multiple combat deployments, Thompson knew immediately that he had witnessed a criminal assault. He also knew that handling the situation would require careful navigation of military protocol and politics. Thompson made his way to the communications center and placed a secure call to the Pentagon. The conversation was brief and coded, but its implications would ripple through the chain of command faster than Morrison could possibly imagine. By evening, Maria had made her decision. She would file a formal complaint through the proper channels, regardless of the personal cost. She had dedicated her life to serving her country with honor, and she wouldn't let Morrison's abuse stand unchallenged. As she prepared her initial statement, describing the months of harassment that had led up to the physical assault, Maria had no way of knowing that powerful forces were already in motion. Her case was about to become much larger than a simple assault complaint. The next morning would bring changes to forward operating Base Sentinel that nobody could have predicted. Morrison's kick had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately expose systemic problems within the unit and bring the full weight of military justice down on everyone involved. The sun set over the base that evening with most soldiers unaware that their world was about to change forever. In less than 24 hours, 3 generals would arrive to personally investigate what had happened to one specialist who had dared to stand up for herself against a system that seemed designed to silence her. Maria spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling of her barracks, every breath sending sharp reminders of Morrison's assault through her bruised ribs. Around her, the other soldiers slept quietly, unaware that their fellow service member was wrestling with a decision that would change everything. By dawn, she had completed her formal complaint, documenting every instance of harassment, discrimination, and the final assault. The report was thorough, professional, and devastating. Maria had kept detailed records of Morrison's behavior for months, including dates, witnesses, and specific incidents that painted a clear picture of systematic abuse. At 0600 hours, Maria walked into the office of Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the base commanding officer. Harrison was a career military man who prided himself on running a tight, efficient operation. When Maria requested to file a formal complaint against Staff Sergeant Morrison, Harrison initially assumed it was a minor disciplinary issue. "What seems to be the problem, Specialist Santos?" Harrison asked, barely looking up from his morning briefing papers. "Sir, I need to report a criminal assault and request a formal investigation into systematic harassment and discrimination," Maria replied, standing at attention despite the pain in her ribs. Harrison's head snapped up. The words criminal assault got his immediate attention. As Maria began to recount the previous day's events, Harrison realized he was dealing with something far more serious than a typical personnel dispute. "You're alleging that Staff Sergeant Morrison physically assaulted you in front of multiple witnesses?" Harrison asked, his voice tense. "Yes, sir. I have medical documentation of my injuries and can provide a list of witnesses who observed the entire incident." Harrison felt a cold, knot forming in his stomach. If Maria's allegations were true, this wasn't just a disciplinary matter. It was a criminal case that could destroy careers and bring unwanted scrutiny to his command. His first instinct was to handle the situation quietly, internally. "Specialist Santos, have you considered that perhaps this incident could be resolved through counseling and additional training for Staff Sergeant Morrison? Sometimes these situations can be." "No, sir," Maria interrupted, something she would never normally do with a commanding officer. "This isn't a misunderstanding or a training issue. This is a pattern of harassment culminating in a criminal assault. I'm requesting a full investigation under Article 31 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice." Harrison studied the young soldier standing before him. Her calm professionalism and specific reference to military law told him that she had thought this through carefully and wasn't going to be dismissed or intimidated. He also noticed how she favored her left side, suggesting her injuries were real and significant. "I'll need to review your formal complaint and conduct preliminary interviews," Harrison said finally. "In the meantime, I'm ordering you to remain silent about this matter while the investigation is ongoing. With respect, sir, I understand the need for operational security, but I also have the right to report this matter to higher authorities if I feel the investigation isn't being conducted properly." Harrison's jaw tightened. Santos was clearly not going to be the compliant victim he had hoped for. "That won't be necessary, Specialist. I assure you this matter will be handled appropriately." After Maria left his office, Harrison immediately called Morrison to his office. The staff sergeant arrived 15 minutes later, confident and relaxed. He assumed he was being called in for a routine briefing or perhaps commendation for finally putting Santos in her place. "Staff Sergeant Morrison, I've received a serious allegation regarding an incident yesterday involving Specialist Santos. Can you tell me what happened?" Morrison launched into his prepared story about Santos being insubordinate and disrespectful, requiring physical intervention to maintain discipline. He described the kick as a corrective physical training measure applied when Santos refused to follow orders. Harrison listened carefully, noting the inconsistencies in Morrison's account and his casual attitude toward what he was describing. Either Morrison genuinely didn't understand the seriousness of his actions, or he was confident that his version of events would be accepted without question. "Staff Sergeant, you're describing a physical assault on a subordinate. Are you aware that what you've just told me constitutes a potential violation of several articles of the UCMJ?" Morrison's confidence faltered slightly. "Sir, I was maintaining discipline and order. Santos was being disrespectful and insubordinate. I used the minimum force necessary to correct the situation by kicking a soldier in the stomach hard enough to require medical treatment. Sir, soldiers need to learn respect. Sometimes that requires physical correction. Harrison stared at Morrison in disbelief. The man seemed genuinely convinced that his actions were justified, which made the situation even worse. Either Morrison was incredibly naive about military law, or he had been operating under the assumption that his behavior would be protected by his rank and position. Staff Sergeant Morrison, you are hereby relieved of duty pending a formal investigation. You are restricted to quarters except for meals and required military functions. You are not to have any contact with Specialist Santos or any potential witnesses to this incident. Morrison's face went white. Sir, I think you're overreacting. This is just a disciplinary matter between me and one of my soldiers. This is a criminal investigation, Staff Sergeant. I suggest you contact a military attorney immediately. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to either Harrison or Morrison, events were already spiraling beyond their control. Master Sergeant Thompson's call to the Pentagon the previous day had triggered a chain reaction that was moving faster than anyone at the base could imagine. The call had reached the desk of General Patricia Hendricks, the Army's highest-ranking female officer and a vocal advocate for military justice reform. Hendricks had spent a 30-year career fighting the same battles that Maria was now facing, and she took allegations of gender-based harassment and assault personally. Within hours of Thompson's report, Hendricks had initiated a priority investigation that bypassed normal channels entirely. She assembled a team consisting of herself, General Robert Chen from the Inspector General's office, and General Michael Torres from the Judge Advocate General Corps. This wasn't just an investigation. It was a statement that the military's highest leadership was taking these issues seriously. The three generals departed Washington that same evening aboard a military transport, arriving at the nearest airbase at 0200 hours. They spent the early morning hours reviewing all available information about Forward Operating Base Sentinel, including personnel files, recent inspection reports, and complaint histories. What they found painted a disturbing picture. Morrison's personnel file showed multiple informal complaints that had been dismissed or handled with minimal disciplinary action. Several female soldiers had been transferred out of the unit over the past 2 years, with exit interviews citing personality conflicts and cultural differences that everyone had chosen to ignore. At 0800 hours, 3 black SUVs pulled through the gates of Forward Operating Base Sentinel. The vehicles proceeded directly to the command building, where General Hendricks, General Chun, and General Torres stepped out in full dress uniforms with enough stars between them to command the entire base 10 times over. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was in the middle of his morning briefing when his aide burst through the door without knocking. Sir, we have 3 generals on base requesting immediate access to your office. Harrison felt his stomach drop to his boots. 3 generals didn't show up unannounced unless something catastrophic was happening. He quickly dismissed his staff and tried to compose himself for what was clearly going to be the worst day of his military career. General Hendricks entered his office first, her presence immediately filling the room with the kind of authority that comes from commanding respect at the highest levels of military leadership. Generals Chun and Torres followed, and Harrison realized that he was facing more combined military authority than most colonels see in their entire careers. General Hendricks, General Chun, General Torres, this is an unexpected honor, Harrison began, but Hendricks cut him off with a gesture. Colonel Harrison, we're here to investigate a reported criminal assault against Specialist Maria Santos. We understand that Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison allegedly kicked Specialist Santos in front of multiple witnesses yesterday morning. Harrison's carefully prepared explanations died in his throat. These generals already knew everything, which meant they had sources of information beyond his control. Yes, ma'am. I received Specialist Santos's complaint this morning and have initiated preliminary. You received the complaint this morning? General Chun interrupted. The assault occurred yesterday, and you're just now beginning an investigation? Sir, I follow proper protocol. Specialist Santos filed her formal complaint first thing this morning, and I immediately... Colonel, we have a witness report from Master Sergeant Thompson that was filed with the Pentagon yesterday evening. Why wasn't this matter immediately reported through proper channels? Harrison felt sweat beading on his forehead. Thompson had gone directly to the Pentagon, bypassing his command entirely. This investigation was already out of his control, and these generals clearly had information he wasn't aware of. We need to interview Specialist Santos immediately, General Torres said. We also need to speak with Staff Sergeant Morrison and every soldier who witnessed this incident. Generals, I've already spoken with both Specialist Santos and Staff Sergeant Morrison. I can provide you with my preliminary findings. Colonel, this investigation is now under direct oversight of the Inspector General's office, General Chen said firmly. Your preliminary findings are noted, but we'll be conducting our own independent interviews. Within an hour, the entire base was buzzing with rumors and speculation. Soldiers who had witnessed Morrison's assault found themselves being called in for individual interviews with three-star generals, while others watched in amazement as the command structure they thought they knew crumbled before their eyes. Maria was called to the conference room at 1000 hours, where she found herself facing three of the most senior officers in the military. General Hendricks introduced herself, and her colleagues then asked Maria to recount the entire incident from the beginning. For the next 2 hours, Maria provided a detailed account of not just the assault, but months of harassment and discrimination that had led up to it. The generals asked pointed questions about specific incidents, witness availability, and her unit's response to previous complaints. Specialist Santos, have you experienced any retaliation or pressure since filing your complaint? General Hendricks asked. Not yet, ma'am, but given Staff Sergeant Morrison's history and influence within the unit, I expect there will be attempts to discredit my account or pressure witnesses to change their statements. General Chen leaned forward. What makes you believe Morrison has influence within the unit? Sir, he's been allowed to operate without consequences despite multiple informal complaints. Other female soldiers have been transferred out rather than having their concerns addressed. The message is clear that challenging Staff Sergeant Morrison is career suicide. The three generals exchanged glances. Maria's assessment aligned perfectly with their preliminary findings about systemic problems within the unit. Morrison's interview, conducted that afternoon, was a disaster. Faced with three generals who clearly understood military law better than he did, Morrison's confident justifications crumbled quickly. His attempts to characterize the assault as legitimate discipline were met with detailed citations of regulations he had violated and criminal charges he was potentially facing. Staff Sergeant Morrison, are you aware that assault on a fellow service member is a court-martial offense that can result in dishonorable discharge and federal prison time? General Torres asked. Morrison's lawyer, a young JAG officer who had been hastily summoned from the nearest base, advised him to remain silent. But Morrison's anger and prejudice were stronger than his self-preservation instincts. Sir, with respect, Specialist Santos has been a discipline problem since the day she arrived. She doesn't belong in this unit, and everyone knows it. Sometimes you have to take physical action to maintain order. General Hendricks stared at him in disbelief. Staff Sergeant, you just confessed to criminal assault in front of three general officers. Do you understand what you just done? The interviews with witnesses were equally revealing. Soldier after soldier confirmed Maria's account, describing not just the assault but a pattern of harassment and intimidation that had been tolerated for years. Several soldiers broke down during their interviews, admitting that they had witnessed previous incidents but had been too afraid to report them. Private Johnson, who had wanted to help Maria after the assault, tearfully described how Morrison had threatened anyone who interfered. He said anyone who helped Santos would answer to him personally. We all knew what that meant. Corporal Martinez revealed that 3 female soldiers had been transferred out of the unit in the past 18 months after complaining about Morrison's behavior. The command always found reasons to move them instead of dealing with Morrison. It sent a pretty clear message. By evening, The three generals had assembled a case that extended far beyond one assault. They had documented evidence of systematic discrimination, failure of command responsibility, and a culture of impunity that had allowed Morrison to operate without consequences for years. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was called in for a final interview as the sun set over the base. The man who had started the day as a confident commanding officer now faced the end of his career. Colonel Harrison, our investigation has revealed systematic failures of leadership and command responsibility, General Chin began. How do you explain allowing Staff Sergeant Morrison to operate without oversight despite multiple complaints? Harrison had no good answers. Every excuse he offered was met with documentary evidence that contradicted his claims. The pattern was clear. He had prioritized unit cohesion and his own career over the safety and rights of his soldiers. As the three generals prepared to leave the base that evening, they carried with them evidence of crimes that would result in court-martials, administrative actions that would end careers, and recommendations for systemic changes that would prevent similar incidents in the future. Morrison spent that night in the brig, charged with assault, conduct unbecoming, and violation of several other articles of military law. His military career was over, and federal prison time was a real possibility. Harrison received notice that he would face an administrative hearing for failure of command responsibility. His career was effectively finished, and he would likely face early retirement under less than honorable circumstances. But for Maria, sitting in the medical facility with her ribs still aching from Morrison's assault, the day had brought something more valuable than revenge: justice. Three generals had arrived within hours of her assault to ensure that the system worked as it was supposed to, protecting soldiers who had the courage to stand up against abuse and discrimination. The message sent throughout the military was clear: harassment, discrimination, and assault would not be tolerated, regardless of rank or position. Those who committed such acts would face the full weight of military justice, and those who failed to prevent them would share their fate. Forward Operating Base Sentinel would never be the same. But for soldiers like Maria Santos, who had dedicated their lives to serving their country with honor, that change couldn't come soon enough. 3 months after the general's visit, Forward Operating Base Sentinel had been transformed from top to bottom. The morning sun still cast the same long shadows across the training grounds, but everything else had changed in ways that would have been unimaginable before Maria Santos stood up to Staff Sergeant Morrison. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, Harrison's replacement, walked through the base, conducting her weekly inspection with a completely different approach than her predecessor. Where Harrison had focused on surface-level discipline and maintaining appearances, Mitchell dug deep into personnel issues, unit culture, and the real experiences of soldiers at every level. "How are things going with the new training protocols, Sergeant Williams?" she asked the NCO who had taken over Morrison's responsibilities. Williams, who had been promoted to fill the leadership gap left by Morrison's removal, stood straighter. The new protocols implemented by the Inspector General's office had revolutionized how the unit operated. Regular climate surveys, anonymous reporting systems, and mandatory training on harassment and discrimination had created an environment where problems were addressed before they escalated. "Excellent, ma'am. The soldiers are responding well to the changes. Morale is higher than I've seen in years, and we're seeing improvement in all performance metrics." Williams wasn't exaggerating. The statistics supported his assessment. Physical fitness scores were up, disciplinary incidents were down, and soldier retention had improved dramatically. When soldiers felt safe and respected, they performed better in every measurable way. Maria had become something of a legend within the unit, though she wore her status uncomfortably. Younger soldiers looked up to her as someone who had stood up to a system that seemed impossible to challenge, while senior NCOs respected her for handling the situation with professionalism and courage. "Santos, how are you feeling about your upcoming deployment?" Colonel Mitchell asked as Maria finished her morning physical training. "Ready for the mission, ma'am. The team is working well together, and I'm confident in our preparation." Maria had been promoted to sergeant and given leadership of a reconnaissance team, a position that would have been unthinkable under Morrison's command. Her promotion wasn't a consolation prize or an attempt to buy her silence. It was based purely on her exceptional performance and leadership potential. The deployment Mitchell mentioned was particularly significant. Maria's team had been selected for a high-priority intelligence gathering mission that would put her skills to the ultimate test. After everything she had endured and overcome, she was finally getting the opportunities her talents deserved. The court-martial proceedings had concluded 2 weeks earlier with results that sent shockwaves throughout the military justice system. Morrison had been sentenced to 5 years in military prison, reduction in rank to private, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and dishonorable discharge. The sentence was severe enough to serve as a clear warning to anyone considering similar actions. Harrison had retired under other than honorable conditions, ending a 20-year career in disgrace. His failure to address Morrison's behavior and properly investigate complaints had been documented in detail, creating a case study that was now taught in leadership courses throughout the military. But the changes extended far beyond individual punishments. General Hendricks had used the case to implement military-wide reforms that addressed systematic problems with how harassment and discrimination complaints were handled. New protocols required immediate escalation of serious complaints, independent investigation of assault allegations, and regular command climate assessments. Maria had testified at Morrison's court-martial with the same calm professionalism she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. When Morrison's defense attorney tried to suggest that she had somehow provoked the assault through insubordination, her detailed recounting of events destroyed his argument completely. Specialist Santos, did you at any time strike Staff Sergeant Morrison or threaten him with physical violence? The prosecutor had asked. No, sir. At no point did I engage in any physical action or threat towards Staff Sergeant Morrison. I maintained military bearing and professionalism throughout our interaction, despite his increasingly aggressive behavior. Morrison's own testimony had been devastating to his case. Under cross-examination, he revealed attitudes and beliefs about women in the military that made clear his actions weren't an isolated incident, but part of a systematic pattern of discrimination and hostility. Do you believe women belong in combat units, Staff Sergeant Morrison? The prosecutor had asked. No, sir. Women aren't built for combat. They're a distraction and a liability. Real soldiers shouldn't have to worry about protecting them when they should be focused on the mission. So in your opinion, Specialist Santos's presence in your unit was inappropriate regardless of her qualifications or performance? Yes, sir. No amount of training can change biology. Women don't belong in special operations. Morrison's lawyers had tried to object, but the damage was done. He had openly admitted to gender-based discrimination in front of a panel of officers who included 2 women. His prejudice wasn't a side issue. It was the motivation for everything he had done to Maria. The most powerful moment in the trial had come when 20 soldiers from Maria's unit testified about the culture Morrison had created. One by one, they described incidents of harassment, intimidation, and discrimination that painted a picture of systematic abuse that had gone unchecked for years. Private Johnson, who had wanted to help Maria after the assault but been threatened into silence, broke down on the witness stand. I knew what he was doing was wrong, but I was scared for my career. I hate that I didn't help her when she needed it. Corporal Martinez testified about the 3 female soldiers who had been transferred out rather than having their complaints addressed. It was clear that challenging Morrison meant career suicide. The command always found reasons to move the women instead of dealing with the problem. Perhaps most damaging was Master Sergeant Thompson's testimony about his attempts to address Morrison's behavior through normal channels. I raised concerns about Staff Sergeant Morrison's conduct multiple times over the past 2 years. I was told that he was an effective leader who just had a direct management style. The court-martial panel had deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The military justice system, when functioning properly, had delivered clear and decisive justice. Now, 3 months later, the effects of that justice were visible throughout the base. Soldiers walked with more confidence, knowing that complaints would be taken seriously and investigated properly. Female soldiers, in particular, felt a freedom to excel without constantly looking over their shoulders for harassment or discrimination. Sergeant Rodriguez, one of the younger female soldiers who had joined the unit after Morrison's removal, approached Maria after morning formation. "Sergeant Santos, I wanted to thank you for what you did. I know it couldn't have been easy." Maria smiled. "You don't need to thank me, Rodriguez. I just did what any soldier should do, stood up for what was right. Make sure you do the same if you ever face a similar situation." "Yes, Sergeant, I will." The conversation reminded Maria of how much had changed. Before Morrison's removal, female soldiers had been isolated and vulnerable. Now, they were integrated members of the team, judged on their abilities rather than their gender. Colonel Mitchell had implemented regular unit meetings where soldiers could raise concerns directly with leadership. The meetings had initially been awkward, with soldiers uncertain whether they could speak freely, but over time, they had evolved into valuable forums for addressing issues before they became problems. "Does anyone have concerns or suggestions they'd like to raise?" Mitchell asked during that week's meeting. Corporal Williams raised his hand. "Ma'am, the new equipment maintenance schedules are working well, but we could use additional training on the updated procedures." "Noted. I'll arrange for additional training sessions next week." "Anyone else?" Private Thompson spoke up. "Ma'am, the new anonymous reporting system has been helpful, but some soldiers are still worried about retaliation. Could we have more education on protective policies?" Mitchell nodded approvingly. The fact that soldiers felt comfortable raising concerns publicly was evidence that the cultural changes were taking hold. "Excellent suggestion. I'll have the JAG office conduct a briefing on protective policies and retaliation prevention." The meetings had become so successful that other units throughout the military were implementing similar programs. Maria's case had become a catalyst for changes that extended far beyond forward operating base Sentinel. General Hendricks had visited the base the previous month to check on the implementation of new policies. She had made a point of meeting privately with Maria to discuss her experiences and gather feedback on the reforms. "How are things going, Sergeant Santos?" Hendricks had asked. "Much better, ma'am. The changes have created an environment where soldiers can focus on their mission without worrying about harassment or discrimination. Any suggestions for further improvements?" Maria had thought carefully before responding. "The anonymous reporting system is working well, but I think we need more proactive training on recognizing and addressing problematic behavior before it escalates. Prevention is better than reaction." Hendricks had smiled. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need from our NCOs. I'll make sure your suggestions are incorporated into our policy development." The conversation had led to Maria being selected for an advanced leadership development program that would prepare her for senior NCO positions. Her experience navigating the complaint process and subsequent changes had given her unique insights into military justice and personnel management. Morrison's fate had become a cautionary tale throughout the military. He was serving his sentence at the military prison in Fort Leavenworth, where his fellow inmates included other soldiers who had committed serious crimes. His dishonorable discharge meant he would forever be marked as someone who had failed to uphold military values. Reports from the prison indicated that Morrison remained unrepentant, blaming Maria and the military justice system for his downfall. Psychologists working with him noted that he showed no understanding of why his actions were wrong, making rehabilitation unlikely. Harrison had moved back to his hometown in Ohio, where he worked as a security guard at a shopping mall. Former colleagues reported that he remained bitter about his forced retirement, claiming that political correctness had destroyed his career. His failure to take responsibility for his leadership failures had made him unemployable in any position requiring judgment or authority. The contrast between Morrison and Harrison's continued defiance and Maria's quiet professionalism had become part of the story that new recruits learned during basic training. The case was now taught as an example of courage, integrity, and the importance of standing up for military values, even when doing so required personal sacrifice. Maria's deployment was scheduled to begin the following month, and she was excited about leading her team on their first major mission. The intelligence gathering operation would take place in a region where her language skills and cultural knowledge would be crucial assets. "Are you nervous about the deployment?" Colonel Mitchell asked during their final pre-deployment briefing. "No, ma'am. I'm confident in my training and my team. We're ready for whatever challenges we might face." Mitchell studied the young sergeant who had transformed her unit through courage and determination. "Your leadership during this entire situation has been exemplary. The changes you initiated by standing up to Morrison have made every soldier on this base safer and more effective." "Thank you, ma'am, but I just did my job." Any soldier should have the right to serve without fear of harassment or assault. That evening, Maria sat in her quarters writing a letter to her younger sister, who was considering joining the military after college. The letter described her experiences over the past year, emphasizing both the challenges and the ultimate triumph of justice. "The military isn't perfect," she wrote, "but it's a place where doing the right thing matters more than rank or politics. When I stood up to Morrison, I knew there might be consequences for my career. But I also knew that staying silent would make me complicit in a system that hurt other soldiers." She continued, "The changes that followed Morrison's conviction have made the military a better place for everyone. Female soldiers no longer have to choose between their careers and their safety. Male soldiers can focus on their missions without worrying about working with someone who creates a hostile environment. And leaders at every level understand that their primary responsibility is to their soldiers, not to protecting problematic subordinates." Maria sealed the letter and prepared for bed, her ribs completely healed and her conscience clear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but she faced them with the confidence that came from knowing she had stood up for what was right and helped create lasting change. The story of her confrontation with Morrison and the general's swift response had become legendary throughout the military. But for Maria, the real victory wasn't the punishment of those who had wronged her. It was the knowledge that future soldiers would serve in an environment where courage was rewarded and harassment was swiftly addressed. Forward Operating Base Sentinel had become a model for military units worldwide. Visitors from other branches and allied nations came to study the cultural transformation that had occurred following Maria's brave stand. The base that had once tolerated systematic harassment and discrimination now led the military in creating inclusive, effective units where every soldier could reach their full potential. As Maria drifted off to sleep, she thought about the young soldiers like Rodriguez who would never have to face the choices she had confronted. They would serve in a military that had learned from her experience and implemented changes that protected everyone. That knowledge made every moment of pain and uncertainty she had endured worthwhile. The morning sun would rise tomorrow on a base forever changed by one soldier's refusal to accept injustice. And somewhere in the distance, 3 generals continued their work to ensure that Maria Santos's courage would inspire generations of soldiers to stand up for what was right, knowing that the system would support them when they needed it most.